Welcome to this lecture inaugurating the Roman Family Directorship of the Neubauer Collegium for Culture and Society. I do bring a sermon, but first let me tell you my name. My name is David Nirenberg, and I'm the first Roman Family Director of the Neubauer Collegium. Or rather, I was the first. Well, I'm still the first, but I was the Roman Family Director for my successor in this beautiful position, Jonathan Lear, from the Committee on Social Thought in the Department of Philosophy, took office October 1st. It's, I think, a sign of just how incredibly fruitful the Roman directorship is that it's produced two directors before it's even been inaugurated. But it is with a touch of sadness that I welcome you to this celebration. Sadness at leaving the Collegium, and sadness at surrendering the privilege of bearing the name of my dear friend Emmanuel, so close to my own. Now let me just say a few words about what makes the Neubauer Collegium and the Roman directorship so precious to me. As you know, the Collegium was established, and its establishment was animated by the conviction, I think long held at this university, that many of the most challenging questions we want to ask and need to ask about ourselves and our world require engagement with cultural and social forms of knowledge that are the province of what Europeans beautifully call the human sciences, the sciences humaines, or at least the French do, and we call things like the humanities and the humanistic social sciences. The Collegium seeks to catalyze that engagement. We have the threefold mission of supporting the faculty of the university in their collaborative pursuit of complex questions that reach beyond the abilities of a single person, or perhaps a single discipline or method, of bringing researchers from around the world to Chicago to participate in those collaborations, and of trumpeting the results of those collaborations to the world. Now, while all of the Neubauer Collegium projects have the humanities or the humanistic social sciences at their core, many of the most difficult questions our scholars are asking involve movement across academic disciplines and divisions with collaborators from every art and science. We're in our second year, and of our 30 projects, we now have faculty from every school, every department of the humanities and social sciences, but every school and division of the university, from Argonne to, I don't actually know any school that ends with Z, but I'm sure there is one, and we span it. And we've welcomed a global array of collaborators from Spain, Syria, Switzerland, just sticking to the S's, China, India, Iraq, Pakistan, France. I could spend the entire evening telling you about the Neubauer Collegium, but that's not why you are here. And that is what web pages are for. I urge you to visit ours. It's on all these posters. What you cannot find on any web page is the many facets, or are the many facets, of my friend Emmanuel Roman. You can read in your program that he is the CEO of the Man Group with an MBA in finance from the Booth School in 1987, and you could probably learn from Google that he was born and educated in France, that he worked for some years at Goldman Sachs, etc. But you will not learn from any of these sources what it feels like to talk to him about a great classical recording from the early 20th century, or to stand with him before Sunday evening in the park at the Chicago Art Institute. Was that your father's favorite painting? Yeah. His company sponsors the Man Booker Prize, but that doesn't explain why he's read nearly every novel ever written in the history of modern literature. Send him an article on mathematical ontology, and you'll receive a trenchant comment from him at his 3 a.m., and although myself a historian, I can't approach his knowledge of 19th and 20th century history. And I've not even begun to talk about his mastery in his chosen field of finance, nor of his voracious philanthropy. So there's much more I'd like to say, but I do know Emmanuel well enough to know that I'm embarrassing him. So let me simply summarize by saying that Emmanuel Roman represents in one person what the Collegium aspires to. I trust you can see why we are so fortunate that its directorship bears his name, and why I'm so sad to be leaving it. So thank you, Manny, and please convey our gratitude to Barry, Miranda, and Maya. Now, names are very important to me, as you can see, but they're not the reason why we invited Emmanuel Saez. His presence here, like yours, is a testament to the importance of his work on questions about the measurement, causes, and consequences of income inequality. These are questions fundamental to every human community, and not only human. Animal studies about monkeys, for example, have shown that they too are concerned with equality. And they are as old as philosophy itself. Plato in his Republic and Laws, Aristotle in his Eudemian and Nicomachean Ethics, all were deeply concerned with economic inequality. Sorry, as a faculty member of the Committee on Social Thought, I have to cite Plato and Aristotle. Parting as they did from the premise that, quote, justice seems to be a sort of equality, and that without that equality, civic friendship, that is, the concord necessary for a stable polity, could not exist. I'm not endorsing that view. I'm simply reporting that this was a concern from the origins of philosophy. And across our campus, from the schools of social service administration, law, medicine, policy, and business, to the many departments of the humanities and social sciences, history, philosophy, many of our colleagues are asking these same sorts of questions from various perspectives. And for many of them, the work of Emmanuel Saez is emerging as a common point of reference. Emmanuel Saez is professor of economics and director of the Center for Equitable Growth at the University of California, Berkeley. As you will know from your programs, he received his PhD in economics from MIT in 1999 and was awarded the John Bates Clark Medal of the American Economic Association in 2009 and the MacArthur Foundation Fellowship in 2010. He has made many important contributions to economics, to the field of public economics. He has combined theoretical and empirical methods to help inform our understanding of optimal taxation and brings it closer to practical policy making, although I should mention that one of his books is called, in French, Pour une révolution fiscale, and revolutions and practical policy making are not always in a comfortable hand in hand. This work has informed policy with regard to the appropriate marginal tax rate for higher income taxpayers, the treatment of capital income, the taxation of married couples, and many other subjects. He's also been centrally involved in the collection of highly detailed data, allowing for the consistent documentation of trends in income and wealth distribution in the US and in many other countries of the world over longer periods of time than was previously possible. This painstaking data collection work and the patterns it has revealed have been crucial inputs in the refinement of theories about the drivers of income inequality in the long run and the causes for the sharp rise in income inequality over the last 4 decades. This data and Saez's work are fascinating for many reasons, not least from the Neubauer Collegium's point of view, is the way in which they develop new historical instruments in order to ask economic questions in new ways that themselves allow us to perceive and pose further questions, historical and economic to be sure, but also ethical and political. So we've tried to reflect some of these multiple engagements in the staging of today's lecture itself. Professor Saez's lecture will receive 2 responses. The first from his fellow economist, fellow MacArthur Fellow, and fellow John Clark medalist, Kevin Murphy, the George R. Stigler Distinguished Service Professor of Economics, whose many interests include the empirical analysis of inequality, unemployment, and relative wages, as well as the economics of growth and development and the economic values of improvements in health and longevity. The second will be from Bill Sewell, the Frank P. Hickson Distinguished Service Professor Emeritus of Political Science and History, whose interests include the emergence of capitalism in early modern Europe, the history of French labor and social mobility, as well as social theory more generally. Each respondent will speak for about 10 minutes, after which we will open the floor to questions, followed by libations and further discussion at the reception outside. But for the moment, please join me in welcoming our first director's lecture, inaugurating the Roman Family Directorship of the Neubauer Collegium, Emmanuel Saez on Income and Wealth Inequality, Evidence and Policy Implications. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you very much, David. It is a pleasure to be here tonight to talk to you about income and wealth inequality, evidence, and policy implications. So let me start with the basics of measuring inequality. So the first thing I want to say, and it's really repeating what David put so beautifully, inequality really matters because the public cares about it, because people have a sense of fairness and will compare their situation relative to others in the economy. So that's really the key reason why we are all together tonight listening about inequality. And that also means that for us researchers, we need to provide transparent inequality measures that the broad public can understand to illuminate the debate. So the goal here is to understand the drivers of inequality trends and the effect of public policy on inequality. So there are two key economic concepts that I will discuss: income and wealth. So income is a flow, and this is the sum of labor income, what you get out of working, and capital income, where capital income is the return you get on your wealth. And wealth is a stock accumulated from savings and inheritances. So what are the basic facts about those concepts? So in aggregate, labor income is about 3/4 of total national income. That leaves 1/4 or a little bit more for capital income. Total wealth is about 400% of total annual income. That is, the stock of wealth represents 4 years of national income. So relating those numbers, that means that the annual return on wealth is about 6 to 7%. That's what you earn in capital income out of owning wealth. So wealth inequality is always much higher than income inequality. Basically, in pretty much any society, the bottom 50% of the population doesn't own any wealth. And in contrast to that, most people do have some income. So what I will be talking about today will be mostly pre-tax, that is really market incomes, before the government comes in and taxes away part of that income and then does redistribution. But I want to point out that a critical evolution of advanced economies is an increasing share of government. So in the US, today the government taxes 1/3 of market incomes to fund transfers and public good, and as a result of that, disposable income inequality is lower, significantly lower than market income inequality. It's a very important thing. The fact that we in advanced societies share a large fraction of our income means, that reflects in some sense the views, of the public, that there should be substantial insurance redistribution of income. So I will be talking first about top income share. So a very simple way to measure inequality is to ask the question, what share of total pre-tax income is going to go to top 10% families, top 1% families, etc. So with colleagues, and notably, Thomas Piketty, who's become worldwide famous, thanks to his book, actually, that discusses a lot of those statistics we've gathered over the years. We have been using individual income tax statistics that are a great source because they cover very long time period. Typically, income taxes start in the early 20th century, 1913 for the United States, and they capture very well top incomes. Okay, so Thomas Piketty actually started this literature with the study of France. Shortly afterwards, I teamed up with him to study the case of the United States. And the United States fascinated people just because the development has been so extreme in terms of inequality and income concentration, as I will discuss. But with many colleagues, we've analyzed a large number of countries in what we've called the World Top Income database. Okay, and so the World Top Income database is a website that gathers all the evidence we've gathered. So you can see in red all the countries that have been studied. They cover, a very large fraction of the world population. So let me start with evidence for the United States. So what this chart shows you, the top 10% income share in the United States. That is the share of total income that accrues to the top 10% families from 1917 to 2012. And so you see that overall it has a big U-shape with high levels of income concentration, the top 10% families getting about 45% of total income before World War II. And then in the US, it's striking to see that the key event is really World War II, where income concentration falls drastically to a level around, in the low 30s and stays that way for a number of decades. And then you have in the recent period a big increase in income concentration. You can see that we move up, from the low 30s in the late 70s, and in recent years we are back to levels above 45%, actually 2012 being the absolute record of income concentration. Now, the next thing I want to show you is that this phenomenon of increasing income concentration has been really happening at the very top of the income distribution. So what this chart does is that it splits the top 10% that you saw before into three groups. The top 1% in black, the next 4% in blue, and the next 5% in red. And so top 1% today in the US, that means family with, roughly speaking, more than $400,000 of annual income. And so what is really striking in this chart for the recent period is that most of the increase that you've seen for the top 10% really comes from the top 1% that goes from less than 10% to over 20% in recent years. There has been some increase for the next 4%, but you can see that it's much smaller, and actually a pretty small increase for the next 5%. And so the higher you go in the distribution, the more extreme are the facts. So this one is the top 0.1%, people with 2 million and more in annual income. And so you can see that here the increase is from 2.5%, to over 10%. So the increase in inequality has that shape that the higher you go, the more extreme it is. The second thing that we find with the data is to look at the composition. That is, what are the incomes of the very high income earners? So this one looks at the top 0.1%. So it's the same chart you saw before, except that now it shows you the composition of those incomes in the form of wages and salaries. So that's labor income, business income, which is a mix of labor and capital income and realized capital gain. And so what is striking in that chart is that early on, before World War II, certainly, the bulk of top incomes was composed of capital income. So these were very wealthy people deriving very large income out of their wealth. What is striking in the recent period is that really a significant part of this increase in income concentration is first a labor income phenomenon. You can see that the share of labor income here increases sharply, business income as well, and capital income to some extent as well. But so that means that although today we are at a level of income concentration that is perhaps similar to what it was before the Great Depression, the composition has changed a lot. That is, there are a lot of people with very high income who actually get it from work. Okay? And as well, if you earn a lot, you may save a lot, and you will eventually accumulate a large fortune. So you might say, why should we care about top incomes? We should care because the effects, the increase in concentration has been so large that it really affects how you think about aggregate growth numbers. So to give you a simple example, if you look at the last 20 years, income as we define it. So it's important to keep in mind here, this is not national income, it's really market income reported on tax returns. So it excludes fringe benefits, etc. So that's why the gross numbers look low relative to GDP. But if you look at that cash market income, that is, will be familiar to most people, it's grown only 18% per family over that 20-year period. Now, for the top 1%, it's grown 86%. So that means that when you remove the top 1%, only 6.6% growth is left, for the bottom 99%. So those are staggering numbers. The bottom 99%, by definition, is the very vast majority. Most people, their gross number is going to look very different from the aggregate number. And the reason, why those numbers have captured, more and more the attention of the press is that it's gotten, perhaps progressively worse. What is really striking is that if you look at the last years, what we call the recovery from the Great Recession, there has been a 6% growth, over those 3 years, 31% for the top 1%. That has pretty much fully recovered from the drop of the Great Recession, and for the bottom 99%, with the inflation, basically they have made no progress in real terms. Okay, so we've looked at income. What has happened in terms of wealth? So remember, in the aggregate, wealth is very important. 4 times annual income, and it represents, 25 to 30% of, it generates 25 to 30% of national income in the form of capital income. So wealth, you will have actually a pretty similar story. So this is the share of wealth in the United States going to the bottom 90%. So remember, wealth is very concentrated, so that number is low. So they are 90%, but they don't have a very large fraction of total wealth. They have, something between 20 to 35%. So you can see at first, in the first part of the century, an increase in the share of wealth going to the bottom 90%. So you can think about that as the democratization of wealth, and that's driven by 2 things mostly, housing, ownership increases, and the development of pensions, funded pensions, and it reaches a peak in the early 1980s, but after that there has been a significant erosion, if you want, of middle-class wealth that has fallen, from more than 35% to, especially during the Great Recession, to a low today of 23%. So most of those gains in wealth democratization appear to have been lost. And so why is there a big decrease like this in wealth of the bottom 90%? So it's 2 things. So one, their incomes haven't been doing very well. And second, and perhaps most importantly, their savings rate has plummeted. Okay, so one way to see that is that a lot of people cashed in on the housing gains, during the housing bubbles, which means effectively this saving. And then when those prices came down, what was left was debt, essentially in the form of mortgages, and so that's why the wealth share came down so much. So the counterpart of that, or the flip side, if you want, is that wealth concentration increases, and it has also this U shape. That is, here you have the top 1% wealth share in the United States, so it starts very high, where the top 1% owns pretty much 50% of total wealth. It comes down, down to 25%. So those are enormous numbers, really, dividing by 2, and then a big increase in over the last 30 years, so that today the top 1% has about, slightly more than 40% of total wealth. So in terms of absolute numbers, the numbers are worth looking at as well because they are really striking. So this chart here shows you the evolution of real average wealth for 2 groups. The bottom 90%, and that's their scale here, in dollars, in real dollars, and that's the white triangles. And then in circles, the top 1% with their scale, blown up by a factor 100, so that the 2 series are visible on the same chart. So what is striking in this graph is that at first you have, so it started in 1946 here, you have growing wealth, for both groups. Then the bottom 90% does actually pretty well, in that period of the 60s and the 70s. And after that, the bottom 90% looks like it increases, but that's mostly driven, by asset price effects. And then during the Great Recession, there is literally, a collapse of bottom 90% wealth and absolutely no recovery in the years afterwards, so that wealth for the bottom 90% in real terms is no higher than it was in the late 1980s. In contrast, you can see that wealth for the top 1% really goes up. So it's true there are bumps and downs during the recessions, but overall the trend is very upward. And again, following the Great Recession, the top 1% starts to recover pretty quickly. Okay, so I have discussed all this already in detail. So let me just say that today the US combines extremely high labor income inequality and very high wealth inequality, and we believe that the very high wealth inequality is in large part driven, by this increase in income inequality due to the fact that the high-income people save a large fraction of their earnings. So that's the case for the US. Analyzing international evidence, thanks to all the data we've gathered, is useful to understand what drives inequality. So the first question you might ask is this pattern that you have documented for the US universal or not? So let's look here at 3 countries. So here again, it is the top 1% income share of income going to top 1% families, and we've put together the United States that we've already seen in black, the United Kingdom in red, and Canada in blue. And so you can see strikingly that all 3 countries follow pretty much the same pattern, with high levels of income concentration early on, significant falls, slightly before World War II, during World War II, and in the post-war period, and then all 3 increase significantly after that. Not as much as the US for the UK and the US, but it's still a very sharp increase. So you might think maybe, those things are driven by globalization forces that are common to all countries. However, it is interesting, to contrast the results I've shown, with 3 other countries. So 2 come from continental Europe, France in black, Japan in red, and then Sweden in blue. And note that the scale I have used on both graphs is really the same. Okay? And so what you see here is that it's true, the first piece is similar as well. All 3 countries start with very high levels of income concentration, including Sweden, that has actually extremely high, off the charts, income concentration, around World War I. Both come down significantly, following each country's history. So you can see that, for example, for Japan, World War II is really the event, that is so dramatic, of course, for the Japanese society and economy. Low levels of income concentration post-war. And so what is striking here is that the increase in income concentration is much smaller than it has been in the other countries. You see, if I show you the 2 graphs like this, that contrast, you think of a U, here you think of an L. Although I should say, that in Sweden, inequality has been increasing as well. This is not, from a one country perspective, this is not a negligible increase. So drop in inequality in the first half of the 20th century seems to be a universal phenomenon. And so I want to insist on that, because from an historical perspective, it is a striking fact. All advanced countries had very high income concentration 1 century ago, regardless of their level of economic development. So, for example, the UK 1900 is a much more advanced economy than Japan 1900, and yet both had similarly high levels of income concentration. So it looks like the Industrial Revolution, the first big burst in economic growth, didn't necessarily have that big of an impact on income concentration. So in the case of France, that has been studied in a lot of detail by Thomas Piketty, he shows that from the revolution to 1900, as well, there isn't a dramatic change in inequality. So that's what explains, Thomas Piketty has spent a lot of time, building that data, thinking about the data. And the conclusion, that he puts in his book is that just economic progress per se certainly doesn't guarantee you that you're going to have income inequality. Economic growth is never going to be enough. Now, all countries experience a sharp reduction in income concentration during the first part of the 20th century, but this is really primarily a capital income concentration. That is, the large fortunes are hit by big shocks such as wars and depression, so it's visible in specific countries that hit top capital earners, combined with government policy responses to these shocks in the form of regulation. So in the case of the US, it's the financial regulation of the New Deal and the development of progressive and inheritance taxation. And the two actually are linked. That is, progressive taxation as a concept exists, before the big wars. The US started in 1913, other countries started before, but when it is started, people think, 10% top rate is the maximum thinkable. Then come the wars with, massive mobilization, and then suddenly countries, in 1 or 2 years, they are going to increase the top rates, to 60%, 70%. That's what happens in the US during World War II. So, but it is in part accidental. Absent those big shocks, it's not clear that progressive taxation would have taken this turn, and obviously it changes the picture because with very sharp progressive income taxation and inheritance taxation, it's much harder to accumulate wealth and to transmit wealth. So now, the recent surge in inequality is driven, it happens in only some countries, not all of them or not to the same degree, and it is driven first by a surge in top labor incomes that then fuels wealth inequality. So the fact that the experiences are so different across countries shows you, that just saying, technical change, globalization is not enough. You have to think about how these factors interact, with local institutions in each countries. That is, policies play a key role in shaping inequality, and so its policies broadly defined, taxes and transfers, regulations, education. So here I'm going to look at top incomes only, and that's why I'm going to focus on progressive taxation, and namely, the role of top tax rates, okay, to try to understand, what are the drivers of this pre-tax increase in income concentration. So here in this chart, I bring back the top 1% income share in the US that we've seen before in black, and I put you on the right scale here, the top tax rate for the federal individual tax, which is a very crude but simple measure of tax progressivity. So when you look at those graphs, what do you see? You see, mirror images of each other. And remember that this is pre-tax, meaning, that this is before, those tax rates have been applied. So it's not the mechanical effect of tax rates. So it is indeed the mirror image of each other. And so, today this is largely forgotten, but for a very long time, the US had a very progressive tax system with top tax rates in excess of 70%, and that was precisely the time where income concentration was low. When those tax rates came down during the Reagan administration, that's when top incomes started increasing. And what I want to point out is that today there are fierce debates about how high the top tax rate should be. So here you have Bush, here you have Obama, here you have Clinton. Fierce debates, but about changes that look extremely small relative to the variations that were experienced historically. Now, in terms of international data, you also see a very strong link between top tax rates and top income. So here you have the world or the advanced economies in 1960s. So you see countries had very different top income tax rates, where the US and the UK actually were the ones using the most progressive income taxation, using the highest top tax rates, and countries like France or Sweden that you associate with redistribution today were more moderate in their policies, and none of the top. So on the y-axis you have the top 1% income shares. It was pretty much below 12% everywhere. Now, fast forward to the world today, looks like this. You can see that the top tax rate have come down pretty much everywhere, but most actually in countries like the US and the UK that were using before the most progressive taxation, and top income shares have gone up. So countries have migrated along a diagonal, so that if you look at the difference, in the time series, you plot the change or the cut in top marginal tax rates and the increase in top 1% income shares, pre-tax again, you see a pretty strong correlation. Okay? So I do believe that there is strong empirical evidence that top tax rates have an effect on pre-tax top incomes. Now, it is critical to understand what is the mechanism linking, pre-tax top incomes to top tax rates. So as an economist, I would start, with the first one here. Supply side, meaning that top earners work less and therefore earn less when top tax rate increase. Okay, and under that scenario, actually, top tax rates should not be too high. A second scenario could be, tax avoidance, evasions. Top earners avoid and evade more when top tax rates are high. The distinguishing those two scenarios is very important because if people work less when top tax rates are high, there's not much the government can do about it. In contrast, if it is tax avoidance, tax evasions, the option the government has is to try to eliminate opportunities for avoidance, so eliminate loopholes, and then possibly have the possibility of increasing top tax rates once the tax system is airtight. The third element that I have that I want to bring is a rent-seeking scenario that is not natural to economists to believe, that markets work well, but the numbers have been so big and the facts so striking that we can't avoid, putting the possibility of this scenario here. The idea there is that top income earners are going to extract more pay at the expense of the rest of the population when top tax rates are low. So what does that mean? So that means that if you're a CEO and top tax rates are 80%, you realize that putting effort into convincing, your board to give you a pay increase is not very productive for you because most of your pay increase goes to the government. In contrast, when top tax rates are much lower, you have a stronger incentive to make money if you are at the top. So obviously, this is controversial, and you really would have to do a study sector by sector. So just to give you an example, in the US, the finance sector is probably the sector that has seen, the biggest increase in pay. Hedge fund managers, private equity managers make staggering amounts relative to 30 years ago. I mean, in part, this industry didn't exist back then. Are they worth what they make? That is, does this money represent a net gain to the economy or not? I mean, you have a story. Some things look like rent-seeking. So, for example, speed trading for hedge funds. It's hard to see why that really adds value, but you can see why it helps one hedge fund to get an edge on others. At the same time, people can say hedge funds provide valuable instruments to diversify risk, and that has value, and that's why they get wealthy, sophisticated clients, and they add value to the economy. So. At this stage, I'm not going to be able to tell you, which scenario we are at, but I want to take a very broad picture to show you a few striking facts, one way or the other. So the first one I want to address is the second one, because some commentators have said, look, those theories really don't tell you anything about inequality. The only thing they tell you is about tax avoidance, tax evasion. So it's very possible that the rich in the 50s and in the 60s were as rich as they are now or as they were before, but it's just that you were not seeing the income because those guys had very strong incentive, to hide it from the IRS. So this is an important critique, so it's very important to address it. So actually, people like myself who work in public economics, we spend a large amount of time, tracing every tax reform, seeing what happens, to income. So we are very interested in tracing out tax avoidance, tax evasion. So I'm not going to bore you with all the details, but I'm just going to show you one fact that suggests that tax avoidance certainly cannot explain everything, and that has to do with the charitable giving behavior of top income earners. So charitable giving in the US is tax deductible, which means that the incentives to give are stronger when tax rates are higher. Because with a high tax rate, you save a lot in taxes, when you give. So under the tax avoidance scenario, reported incomes and reported charitable giving should move in opposite direction. That is, those guys, in reality, they are really rich. Therefore, they should give a lot, and particularly they should give a lot because the tax rates are so high. Okay? So you can then trace the evolution of charitable giving of the rich, and here that's how much top 1% incomes give relative, to the average income in the economy. So basically the rich there were able to give 35% of the average income in the economy. Now they are able to give 80% of the average income in the economy. So the reason why I normalize it that way is to compare it with the evolution of their top income share, on that scale. They had 10% of income there. Now they have 20%. So, but what you see is that 20 times, the average income, is that those two lines really have evolved in a very, very parallel way. So the rich today give much more than they used to give, and guess what? That much more corresponds pretty much to how much more income they have. So this is very strong evidence that indeed the rich are richer, and that with tax avoidance, tax evasion, you are not going to explain the graph I showed. Now, what about supply side versus rent seeking? So the reason, I skipped that one, but obviously because it was so obvious. But under supply side, you don't want to tax the rich because they produce. Under rent seeking, it's the reverse. They steal, in some sense, from the rest of the economy. So taxing them is really what you want. So that's why really distinguishing between those two cases is so important. So under rent seeking, growth in top 1% incomes should come at the expense of the bottom 99%, and conversely. So it's very hard to establish that fact. So I'm not going to prove it one way or the other, but I want to point out a striking fact. So we hear, and indeed it is true, that in the long run, economic growth lifts all boats. That is, everybody ends up benefiting from economic growth. And so let's look at economic growth over a century in the United States. So we start here from a base 100 in 1913 for the top 1% and the bottom 99%. And so that's done on a per adult basis. And let's see how incomes are going to grow over a century. What is true is that by 2013, there has been significant economic growth, so that both groups are around 400. Incomes have been, in real terms, per adult, have been multiplied by 4. Growth lifts all boats. But what is striking in that graph is how the pattern of growth is different across the two groups. So take, coming out of the Great Depression, and the New Deal, what you see is that from 1933 to the 70s, you had fast growth for the bottom 99% and slow growth for the top 1%. And that's precisely the time where the tax rates were extremely high. After that, after the 70s, the pattern, switches. That is, you have slow growth for the bottom 99% and very fast growth for the top 1%, and that's precisely when the top tax rates are high. So it is a striking fact, to see here is that economic growth is going to benefit different groups very differently over time. So that doesn't prove it's consistent with rent seeking, but obviously, doesn't prove it because it's possible, that the top 1% are really producing more, they are more valuable, while the bottom 99%, starting in the 70s, suddenly doesn't really, add, their productivity doesn't increase as much. So to summarize, I think that because this debate is so important. We will see more and more research on this critical question, and I think the way progress is going to be made is case study by case studies. So people will study, some specific sector, say in the financial sector, CEOs. There is a huge literature that studies CEO pay, and that's how we are going to make progress. I just gave you here, the very big picture so that you see how important in the aggregate this phenomenon is. So let me conclude with policy conclusions. So first thing is that US historical evidence and international evidence shows that tax policy plays a key role in shaping inequality, or at least qualifying it. Definitely at the top, what happens, with progressive taxation and top tax rates seems to play a very big role. High top tax rates certainly reduce pre-tax income of the rich. I think that's undeniable. Whether or not they hurt economic growth depends on whether you are in the supply side or the rent-seeking scenario, and that one is open to debate. Third thing is that obviously which scenario we are on is going to affect the public. That is, public will favor more progressive taxation only if it is convinced that the top income gains are detrimental to the 99%. And my view is that it is impossible to explain why top tax rates were so high in the US and in the UK without thinking that that's what society thought at that time, because otherwise, from an economic perspective, it's crazy to have such high tax rates. You can justify them really only if you think, that there is a lot of rent seeking at the top of the distribution. So I may want to qualify this one again, due to the historical record. Advanced economies lived for a very long time, centuries, with very high levels of income concentration, as I showed you in the chart. And it really took exceptional events, really like mass war mobilizations, for those societies to decide to suddenly use very progressive taxation. And that's true in democracies. France and the US had been democracies for centuries, or in more authoritarian regimes. So it's not clear, what is going to happen moving forward. At least we have the advantage, of a historical perspective. We know that very progressive taxation has been tried without creating an economic disaster, and certainly with creating societies that had much less income concentration. Naturally, in a globalized world, progressive taxation will require international coordination, to keep tax avoidance, evasion low. So it's not an easy a problem to solve. But if there is the public will, we, the technocrats, who will think about ways, to go around the problems of enforcement. Thank you very much.
Well, thank you very much. I'm going to make a few comments, hopefully not take too long, give us plenty of time for discussion. Couple things. One is, in case anybody here thinks the growth in inequality is not real, I think you're gravely mistaken. There has been a tremendous growth in inequality in the United States and in many other countries, particularly the English-speaking countries. Although when you look at the Sweden numbers, there was a big growth. The level was low, but if you did that scale in logs, it was a big growth, kind of not that dissimilar. And I'll get back to this whole measurement question later, because it turns out to actually be important on how. And actually, much of what I'm going to say is going to be that the growth in inequality is a big picture of growing inequality that we didn't see here today, and which I think is informative in many ways. And maybe it tells us that the growth in inequality is an even bigger story than what Emmanuel talked about, but it also changes maybe how you view things. So this is the premium for college education is measured in the U.S. on a return per year of schooling. And the premium went up. If you notice his graphs, they really started going up about 1978. It's almost exactly the same time this graph starts going up. And the premium for a college education on a measured per year of schooling goes from, let's call it 5 to 6% up to 12 to 14%, more than doubles over that period of time. A little bit smaller than what we saw for that high income group, but actually more close than you might think. The timing actually isn't even that different. It goes up a lot, then it kind of levels, and it goes up again, and then it kind of level at the end. Go back and look at his graph. Looks very, very similar. And this is based on data. Nobody in that top 1% is in this. They're just not even going to get counted. If we look at inequality across the 1970 to 2012 period by percentile, this is the growth in real log wages for men and women by percentile, you can see that there was a very broad-based growth in inequality. That is, as the 60th percentile did better than the 40th percentile, did better than the 20th and the 80th. I mean, it's really well ordered, pretty much an expansion of the whole distribution. So what's going on at the top is mirrored way down the distribution. And like I said before, magnitudes actually aren't as different as you might have thought. And the reason is you really want to think about the premium. You want to think about the premium you get. So if I get a 40% premium for college and it goes up to 80%, that's a doubling. You don't want to think just about relative wages. And then for the guys at the real top, it all is premium, right? Because it's all the increase over what's down low. Simplest way to think about why you want to measure it, let's say the college premium went from 40% to 80%. What would you think would happen to the premium for guys with 2 years of college? It wouldn't go up by the same absolute amount. You might think as a crude approximation it would go from 20% to 40%, or roughly double on the premium side. When you look at things that way, you see a very different picture. For example, if we look at relative wages, the 95th percentile of the wage distribution, nothing in here about time worked. Again, look at that 95th percentile relative to the median wage. Starts going up almost exactly the same time. Almost exactly. This is not the super rich. These guys are like, Joe Guy. And they're going up. And look at how much it goes up. The relative wage is about 2.25, which means the premium is about 125%. It goes up to about 300 plus ratio, which is a premium of 2.4. It's almost 2.5, almost exactly doubles. Very similar to the return to schooling. So we're seeing broadening inequality at the top end of the wage distribution that mirrors what we're seeing at that very top. Now, what's going on? Do we think that's top tax rates driving all this stuff? Or do you think it's the things that people have talked about in this literature for a long time, which is technology and things driving it? That the growth in inequality has to do a lot with the growth in technology and the growing demand for skills. But the other side of it is important to remember is that supply matters too. That is, it's not just about the demand for skill, it's also the supply of skill. And that gets us thinking about a whole concept that was missing in the discussion, which is human capital. Human capital is really important. And we've had a world in which human capital has become more and more valuable over time. Go back to the composition of earnings at the top. Where did that come from? Because property income went up a lot? No, it's because the returns to labor, returns to business income, again, related to human capital. So growing returns to human capital play an important role. Now, where did that come from? Part of it is technology. And when we think about technology, we think about things like computers and things like that. But there's a whole other side to technology, which is markets. That is allocation of resources across people. And as markets improve, that's going to favor more skilled people. It makes it easier to attract more capital, more talent to work with you. And as that capital and talent can flow more readily to more skilled people, that's going to tend to raise the return to human capital. Now, there's a natural cure, and we've had rising demand for human capital for a long time, for at least for the last century. And what you see when you look at the data is that it's a very simple story to talk about where those returns come from. Let me kind of go ahead. This is a picture based on a model Eric Katz and I did back in the early 90s. and it's extrapolated out. Unfortunately, I don't have it all the way till today. But the point of this graph is we try to explain fluctuations in the return to college using supply and demand. Just a very simple model. That demand for skill is growing, has been growing, continues to grow. When supply grows faster than demand, prices fall. When demand grows faster than supply, prices rise. That story turns out works really well. It works to explain the differences between the U.S. and Canada, can explain the differences in the U.S. over time. That, again, points us back to human capital. Now, I don't have time to go through it all, but there's a lot of reasons one would want to bring human capital into the earlier discussion. For example, we talked about wealth. The big thing that's missing in the discussion of wealth is human wealth. And remember, human capital returns count for a big fraction of total income. They actually would count for a big fraction of wealth if we ever counted it that way. We just don't count human wealth when we measure wealth stocks. And for most people, their wealth is them. That's where their wealth lies, in their human capital, not in the assets that they. And in fact, the stuff we measure for them, we probably shouldn't even be counting, like houses. Because when the price of houses go down, your wealth goes down, but you have to pay for a house too. It's on the other side. Economists say it's on the other side of the budget constraint too. So in fact, it kind of nets out in the aggregate in a lot of ways as the price of housing changes. Not to say it doesn't reduce your real, your material wealth, but it also reduces your present value of your future expenditures. So what else do we want to say? What else do we learn by looking at these data? We learned something else. Here's again that college return. That's how many people went to college. That's the fraction of young guys that went on to college. That's amazing, right? It says that people respond. People respond to returns. When the returns go up, more people go. Pretty striking. What's amazing to me is economists found out about the rise in returns to schooling here. We look back, people have been going already. People responded before we knew. I find that striking. They're smarter than us. We shouldn't find that striking. I guess I shouldn't find that striking. It's not striking at all. This is like what happened to hours by percentile comparing 70s to 2010 to 2012. Again, you see pretty dramatic changes in hours. So what do we learn by looking at all this stuff? And I wish I had more time to talk about. I think the big story is human capital. I really do. And the evidence is that the returns, not just at the very top, have mirrored what's gone on at lower levels of the distribution. And once you think about it as human capital, I think that has some really profound effects on how you look at the world. One, it says families really matter, for example. Education really matters. And one of the things, I showed you the number of people going on to school, going on to college, how that responded so strongly to the return to college. The sad news is the number of people completing college didn't nearly keep pace with that. And that's because we had lots of people who are poorly prepared to go to school and to get the human capital they need. And the fact that supply matters is really important because it says when you increase the number of people with human capital, that not only benefits the people who get the human capital, it reduces the return, narrows inequality, benefits the people who are left behind because it reduces the supply of competing workers at the low end of the skill distribution. A couple other things I'll try to mention that I think are and the other thing about human capital that's important, unlike physical capital and human capital are both really important economic concepts, but they differ in a very important way. I get to work with other people's physical capital when I go to the office. I do get to work with their human capital too. But the key is if I'm on that, the big difference is I take my human capital home with me. And if I don't have the good human capital skills, it not only affects what I can do in the workplace, it affects how I educate my kids, it affects how I make my financial decisions, it affects how well I treat myself now that more and more health care is taking place in the household. Failure to address the human capital side of things, which I think I think that's where we need to address things much more. So it's not that inequality is not a big deal. It's not that inequality doesn't matter. It's that inequality is, in fact, a bigger deal, It affects not just inequality between the guys at the very top and everybody else. It affects tremendously inequality within the bottom 99%. And I think that's all tied into human capital. And doing something on the human capital front is a national imperative. Now, problem is human capital is one of the most durable assets we have. Lasts a long time. Which means one thing is you live with your mistakes for a long time. If you don't do a good job, with physical capital, you're going to replace it in a few years anyway. Human capital, people stay in the labor market for 40 years. And the mistakes we make today last a long time. Human capital is also cumulative. You don't do a good job educating a kid in the 1st through 3rd grade, he's going to have a hard time catching up when he gets to college. In fact, the evidence is it's almost, virtually impossible to do that. So I guess what I would say is we should focus much more on human capital. I think the growth in inequality has a lot to do with technology, particularly technology of allocating resources and allowing the most talented people to actually capture more and more value that they wouldn't have been able to capture absent that. So technology is not just scientific knowledge, it's also the increased functioning of markets. So actually it's funny, increased functioning of markets can actually exacerbate this problem. A couple of observations I would add. If you look at the top, I think it's very consistent with that. There's been a broad-based increase in earnings. It's happened for athletes, actors, people who run privately held companies for which it would be hard to think that they are doing a better job of stealing money from themselves. There are lots of things going on there. Also, the increase in the number of people who are self-made, who created their own wealth, greater today than it's been in the past. Fewer of those people based it on family income. What I think is the story of the future is human capital inheritance. It's what you inherited from your parents on the human capital side. I think that's in keeping with my general view that human capital is probably where the most action is. I think it still remains to complete the research here. I think the circumstantial evidence at least points me toward human capital is where I'm going to focus. And thank you very much.
I'm really pleased to be able to comment on this lecture. I've been admiring the work of Emmanuel Saez at a distance for several years, since reading a famous 2003 article in the Quarterly Journal of Economics that compares the trajectories of U.S. and French inequality. This is a co-authored piece with Thomas Piketty. I'm not an economist. I'm not a statistician. But I don't see how anyone can dispute the solidity of Saez's findings about the U-shaped course of inequality in the U.S. over the past century, or about the extraordinary differences between the U.S., say, and most of continental Europe in the shape of those curves. I recognize that there can be plenty of argument about the causes of this U-shaped trajectory, and also that there's lots of disagreement about how much growing inequality actually matters. I think many economists and certainly many politicians would argue that the most important question is not distribution of income, but whether there's a rising tide that lifts all boats. I think we've all used that cliche by now, even if it lifts some boats more than others. Now, I personally think that extreme inequality of the sort we have in the United States today is bad for society, even if ordinary people's boats are being lifted significantly. Extreme inequality just it partly offends my personal sense of justice. I also think that extremes of wealth and poverty tend to foster political and personal cynicism and mistrust, and this at all levels of the income hierarchy. But in any case, we now know, largely thanks to Emmanuel Saez and his various collaborators, that incomes of Americans below the top quarter or so of the distribution have basically stagnated since the 1970s. There has been substantial economic growth since the late 1970s, but nearly all of its benefits have gone to those at the very top. This is what Saez's research shows very clearly. The spectacular rise in income and wealth of the 1% and the 0.01% has hardly trickled down the income scale at all, at least past the first 10 or 15 or 20%. Certainly not enough to raise any boats down there. We also know that growth has not been more rapid over the past 30 years in advanced capitalist countries that have rapidly rising inequality like the US, Canada, and UK than in those with lower inequalities like Germany or Sweden or France. In his lecture this afternoon, and also in a recent article in Science, which he was kind enough to circulate to those of us giving comments, Saez notes that the American form of inequality, that is extreme upward redistribution with apparently no positive effect on economic growth, seems to rule out the supply-side argument about inequality. Instead, Saez argues, at least tentatively, that the rent-seeking explanation of extreme inequality is actually far more plausible. That is, that the wealthy have systematically manipulated the system to shift income upward. As evidence, he shows that pre-tax income inequality rises when top marginal tax rates fall, both over time in the US and also comparatively across advanced capitalist countries. Apparently, the possibility of keeping a higher portion of earnings makes the wealthy avid to get more money, by hook or by crook. Saez and Piketty particularly think that when earnings bonanzas beckon, executives spend an economically wasteful portion of their energies on bargaining up their compensation. I should say, as an aside, this behavior on the part of executives actually seems to me somewhat counterintuitive. If you accept a notion of declining marginal utility of income, you might expect that a rise of incomes that results from slash taxes would slacken the desire for yet higher earnings. Declining marginal utility should mean that each additional million has less utility than the previous million. And I think it pretty clearly does. So if you've just gotten a couple of million gratis from the feds by a sudden cut in income taxes, you should care less than you did before about extracting additional income from your workers, shareholders, and customers. So it appears to me that we're facing not a rational mechanism of declining marginal utility, but rather a totally irrational mechanism of endlessly accelerating greed that's driving this top-end inequality. Now, I noted that Saez is rather tentative about the rent-seeking argument. I presume this is because he has no direct statistical smoking gun to prove that it's rent-seeking by the wealthy that's produced extreme inequality. He has only inferences that are based on economic statistics that are consistent with such an argument, and he presented the argument and a quick look at the statistics here. What I would like to propose is that the smoking gun that Saez needs actually exists, but not in his field of economics. The smoking gun, I'd suggest, is supplied best, I think, at this point, by a couple of political scientists, David Hacker and Paul Pearson, in their book with the title The Rise of Winner-Take-All Politics, published in, I think, 2012, something like that. In this book, Hacker and Pearson have pinpointed some of the most important mechanisms that have, in fact, been used by the very rich to shift income from the poor and the middle classes to themselves since the late 1970s. But these, the mechanisms that they're looking at happen not in economic markets, but rather in the realm of politics. The first and in some sense encompassing mechanism is a sustained organization by sustained political organization and political spending by business interests. This is something that takes off in the 1970s. Why in the 1970s? Well, profits were falling in the 1970s, certainly by comparison with the boom years of the 50s and the 60s. There was slower economic growth. There was rapidly increasing international competition. This is the period when the United States automobile market, for example, is flooded by Japanese imports in particular. And it's also the case that in the 1970s, even though there were these problems, these pressures on profits, labor unions were strong enough to keep wages up. So there was a squeeze on profits in this period. Businesses responded to this, and this is detailed very nicely in the Hacker and Pearson book. They responded by organizing like they'd never organized before and spending on politics like they'd never spent on politics before. They made huge increases in direct political contributions. They increased their expenditure on lobbying manyfold. They also established and lavishly funded pro-business think tanks like the American Enterprise Institute and the American Heritage Society. Since the late 1970s, business interests have pumped countless millions into funding, in particular, the Republican Party. This, according to Hacker and Pearson, was seen by business organizations as essentially an investment. Okay? Since Republicans were already much more business-friendly than the Democrats, spending to get more Republicans elected would naturally enhance business-friendly legislation. Business interests therefore funded both incumbent Republican office holders. You obviously want to fund incumbents so that they're friendly to you when some sort of issue comes up, but also Republican challengers to Democratic incumbents. At the same time, the promise of yet more munificent funding in exchange for business-friendly votes made the Republicans much more business-friendly over time, over the course of the 1970s and the 1980s, and right up to the present. Now, business interests also increased their funding to Democrats, but at a lower level, and for the most part not with the same logic. It wasn't as an investment. Rather, it's what Hacker and Pearson call insurance. That is, by providing significant funding exclusively to incumbent Democrats, business interests could often have just enough leverage to keep these Democrats their funding from systematically opposing business-friendly legislation. Now, we know, of course, that by the 1990s, business interests were also beginning to invest in Democrats, at least selectively. This was especially true, this is well documented, of Wall Street, which found its greatest benefactor in Democratic Congressman, later Senator, Chuck Schumer of New York, currently the number 3 Democrat in the Senate. So you can see that people well funded by business have done very nicely within the Democratic Party as well in recent years. The value of selective investments in Democrats was made clear when Bill Clinton, Robert Rubin, and Larry Summers led the charge in deregulating Wall Street in the 1990s. So by investing now in Democrats, they're getting a lot of bang for their buck. So what did all this business largesse accomplish? Well, most obviously, it got legislative accomplishments, like the big tax cuts for the wealthy. First, under Ronald Reagan in 1981. So the tax cuts, you have to explain why there were these tax cuts when the Republicans took power, or when Reagan came into power in 1981, when he came into office. That's because there was already this massive effort underway on the part of business in favor of pro-business legislation. And then again, there were massive tax cuts under George W. Bush in 2001 and 2003. Business largesse also brought something important, union busting, especially the emasculation of the National Labor Relations Board. One consequence of union busting has been the by now very substantial fall in wages in manufacturing. Another is that when top managers grossly increased their salaries and bonuses, they got zero pushback from labor. So this is taking away one of the constraints on the rent seeking on the part of the CEOs and top of management. A third consequence is that labor, which previously had been a huge funder of Democrats, labor actually was spending more on elections than business was before the 1970s. So labor used to be a huge funder of Democrats, but it's been totally outclassed by business funders, even within the Democratic Party. Business largesse also crucially got systematic deregulation of business. The most notorious example was probably the repeal of Glass-Steagall, which, as you probably know, the Glass-Steagall Act had stringently regulated banking. This was done in 1991, near the end of the Clinton presidency. But from the beginning of Reagan's presidency on, there has been deregulation of industry after industry. Now, Hacker and Pearson. So there are a lot of positive legislation that's happened on behalf of business. Hacker and Pearson also show that there were legislative accomplishments of a more subtle kind. This is where expenditure on lobbying was particularly valuable. And spending on lobbyists, the number of lobbyists in Washington has absolutely skyrocketed since the mid-1970s. Lobbyists carefully followed all legislation that affected their clients, and they quietly influenced the writing of laws by those they support by suggesting to friendly lawmakers seemingly innocuous technical language that could in fact have very substantial effects on the bottom lines of the businesses that they represented. So lobbying also turned out to be an excellent investment on the part of business. This subtle lobbyist input into drafting laws was made much easier, of course, by the fact that so many lobbyists were themselves former legislative aides, or for that matter, former legislators, who had moved on to highly lucrative positions representing businesses on K Street. A final mechanism enriching the rich and squeezing the rest that benefited from business largesse has been what Hacker and Pearson call drift. It turns out that you often don't actually need to enact any new legislation to enrich the rich. The same end can be served by failing to enact new legislation when circumstances change. The most obvious case is the minimum wage, which in the U.S. is not linked to inflation. Hence, as inflation progressed, the value of the minimum wage has fallen dramatically. No legislative action was needed to make this happen. All that was needed was delays and inaction so that no legislation adjusting the minimum wage could pass. So it's lack of legislative action on things that would correct these changes that are ongoing. This mechanism of drift is particularly pertinent, I think, to the financial industry. in which much innovation is developed actually in order to get around existing regulations, right? It makes sense. There's a cat and mouse game going on between the regulators and the interests that are being regulated. Now, if new regulations are not passed, because basically both parties by the late 1990s are against, basically unfavorable to regulation, if new regulations are not passed, or if regulatory agencies like the Securities Exchange Commission are packed with people who have a deregulatory program, even the most dangerous financial innovations will go unchecked. And we've seen what the effect of that has been over these last few years. In short, I would argue that we actually have very strong evidence of systematic and highly successful rent-seeking by wealthy business interests over precisely the years in which the United States has experienced runaway inequality. But the evidence doesn't come from economists using mathematical equations and the most up-to-date econometric techniques. Rather, it comes from institutionally minded political scientists, in this case, who dig into the detailed mechanisms of lobbying, of electoral politics, and of legislation. Saez and his various collaborators, in my opinion, have done an absolutely splendid job of clarifying the extent and the economic dimensions of rising inequality in the United States and elsewhere in the world. And I think this is something that's politically very important as well as intellectually very important. I'm not sure whether, say, Saez and Piketty are more responsible than the Occupy movement, which invented this wonderful slogan about the 1% against the 99%. But in any case, inequality has become a major issue in contemporary discourse and contemporary politics in the last few years, and it absolutely had not been before. I was amazed. For many years, I've been following the rising inequality, and there just seemed to be absolutely no political and cultural uptake about it. Now it is happening, and in part, I think it's because of the fabulous work that Emmanuel Saez and his various collaborators have done. Now, but I also don't think that we can either adequately explain or adequately undo extreme inequality without combining economic analysis with insights and findings of other disciplines in the social sciences. Political science, obviously in this case, but I think also potentially sociology, anthropology, psychology, and history as well. So I think a more interdisciplinary effort and collaboration, specifically, I think, between economists and others. My suggestion to Emmanuel Saez is Paul Pearson is in the same campus. I'm sure you know each other. You should sit down together and try to look at how you put together your two perspectives on what are essentially the same phenomenon. Thank you.
So, like our panelists, you should ask no small questions. We have microphones, and the microphones will come to the questioner. I have a question here in a gray-green shirt.
Good evening. Thank you very much, gentlemen, for your presentations. Hi. Good evening. Thank you very much, gentlemen, for your presentations. I have two questions for Dr. Saez. The first one, do you think that the drop in savings rates for the bottom 90% has anything to do with an increase in spending on marketing, advertisements? And second, the jump in U.S. Taxation seemed to happen from the graph in the mid-30s. But then the drop in inequality didn't happen until 1945 from the graph that I saw, when production was at near full capacity. So do you think that inequality would also be related to production? And then a proposal for how to moderate inequality would also include production and not just taxation. Thank you.
Thank you. Yes, so about the falling savings rate in the United States, the reality is that we don't know very well. That is, some people think, stagnating income means that you want to consume more, so that opens, the possibility then for the finance sector to provide, debt, borrowing, So we saw it during the run-up of the housing bubble. Really, what happened there is that new products were sold, home equity loans, new mortgages. So it's very hard to pin down what is the original, what is really causing what. And actually, Marianne Bertrand has written a paper, suggesting that indeed, stagnating income creates, a wish of people, to borrow more. So that's a very important question. So on economic growth, so really, so the timing is not exactly the same, for the very top and the rest of the top 10%. So when you look at the full top 10%, it looks like the big fall is World War II. But in reality, for the top 1%, the fall starts, really at the beginning of the Great Depression. So it lines up more closely, with the tax data. But it's very clear that the enormous economic growth, during World War II, combined with what the government was doing, to try to make sure inflation wouldn't increase, they were imposing very stringent wage controls, but especially for high earners. So that has been very well documented by economists. Claudia Goldin and Robert Margo have a famous paper called The Great Compression, where they show why, those government policies had a tremendous impact on the wage structure. And so what is striking from an economist perspective is why, after the war, when those wage controls were lifted, you didn't have immediately a bounce back of the wage structure, to what markets should have been making. So it's another element that suggests that it's not only markets, that institutions have a large impact and sometimes, a lasting impact.
In the back, yes, with the glasses of the beard. I'm sorry, there's no better way for me to identify you in a large group.
Question for Dr. Murphy. You talk about human capital, but I didn't hear you addressing the problems that a lot of students are facing graduating and not being able to find jobs and working McDonald's. Also, the difficulty of paying back the student loans, which are growing at tremendous rates. And I was wondering how that factored in. Thank you.
I would say a couple things. One is we've had college graduates have struggled, but they haven't struggled nearly as much as those that don't graduate from college or those that don't even graduate from high school. I think the premiums include the difficulty of finding jobs. Employment differences remain large between those groups. Predictable things have happened as the returns to schooling gone up. Tuitions rose substantially in both public and private, almost coincident with the rise in premium for a college education. I mean, derived demand seemed to have driven up those prices rather sharply. I again think the big issue is, are people prepared? And one of the things you notice is women have done much better than men over that period in terms of taking advantage of higher education. And I didn't present it today, but it's pretty clear one of the reasons why is they're much better prepared in general than men to go on to college, particularly on the margin. That if you look at high school grades, look at high school scores for the marginal women going to college compared to the marginal men, it's a pretty big difference. You see the women do better when they go to college. Contrary to the old days when men were more likely to complete, it's reversed the other way around now. So there's a lot of differences. I see the issues secondary, we really need to do a better job of getting people ready for college. That's, to me, the one. It's not just college. We use college as like the window because we can see college. But human capital, education is only a small piece of it. It's skills and there are other dimensions of human capital. The problem is we just don't measure them very well. Differences in people within an education level are huge relative to differences across education levels. And the evidence is the rise in returns to human capital have occurred both within and across education. And somewhat different timing, but roughly the same magnitude. So I think education is not the only answer, but skills matter, and the supply of skills matter. We grew skill supply very rapidly in that post-war period. That's part of the story. And it really slowed down a lot post-1980, the slowdown in the growth of skills. And we talk about why, if inequality is rising, why isn't growth going up? Well, if you're slowing down your human capital growth, and that's one of the reasons why the returns to skills are going up, that's not going to be a great environment for increasing output growth because you're going to be slowing the growth of inputs.
Can I add something? Yes. So I fully agree with Kevin that human capital, education is critical. But what I want to point out is that education is essentially provided in advanced economies. The role of the government is overwhelming in that sector. The rise of government, it's education, health, and retirement. And education is very, very important. So it's really a public policy a problem, and indeed economists do calculations, and it looks like even though college is heavily subsidized in the US, it's not as subsidized as in other countries, and that's why people have to take on big loans, etc. It looks like inducing people to go to college, by expanding Pell Grants, etc., pays for itself. That is, it costs the government something, but the government is going to recoup, more than that money in extra taxes paid because the college premium is so high. And poorly prepared student, that's probably, because of the failure of schools, etc. So there, and the government is largely responsible, for K to 12. There's also a big gap in the U.S. in terms of preschool. The U.S. stands out relative to other advanced countries in not providing, universal preschool. And colleagues actually here at Chicago, Jim Heckman is famous for having shown, that what you learn your educational experience very early on has very long lasting consequences. So I fully agree that the US should do a lot more on that front.
And let me just point out one other thing, which is the inequality is not just in incomes, it's in health outcomes and other things that also have shown widening inequality across education levels and other things. And that, again, I think ties back into the human capital story and the disadvantages that different groups have in acquiring that human capital.
Please.
Before we leave that subject, I wanted to take advantage of the fact that we actually have a French-educated person here, because when you were mentioning, early education and the conversation about human capital, I'm thinking about different ways public policy in U.S. and France takes about in its approach to homeschooling versus the government-determined skill mix that is better for the future generation of workers. What I noticed is that while in U.S. homeschooling is very promoted because it's cheaper, it's individual, each family according to its values can provide what they feel family, better fit, what fits the child, which is each one child is different and not equal. While in France, what I've been following, the reverse is happening, where the government is actually promoting more state-based education and precisely arguing that we as a state know more about what would fit the market 10 years up the road. So I just wanted to make sure that this is also kind of noticed, because each person is created equal but different. So to match the educational system with individual child and a 10-year, roughly, horizon to what the economy would look like, and not to teach the stock of skills, but the way to learn, So that's just subject before, conversation moved away. I wanted to stress that as well. I think it's very important.
Does anyone want to address it? I'm not sure it was phrased as a question.
What I want to say, yes, coming from France and arriving here in the United States, I'm really struck at how much more costly it is here to raise children. And even for wealthy people, like us, I see colleagues, with young kids, they really struggle. It's extremely expensive. So the government does it relatively cheaply, and that's probably why, overwhelmingly it's publicly provided. It's a lot cheaper now. If wealthy parents or parents, who have strong views want to do it themselves, fine, subject to some regulations. And I want to point out also the fact that the U.S. doesn't have good preschool has enormous cost because it forces many women to leave the labor force when the women have gotten, those excellent college educations and they would be making significant money. But the way it's organized in the U.S., you have a kid, you want to keep working, you need a nanny, and suddenly you are talking, an enormous amount, much, much higher than how France, does it, through the public sector.
Yeah, if I could come in on this just briefly. I think if we're going to improve human capital in the United States, we can't possibly do it without a lot more public expenditure. And the story that I've been telling is partly one of the outcomes of the lobbying campaigns and the political expenditures and so on has been anti-tax, trying to have low taxation be the most important issue. If taxes are very low, then it's impossible to have a good public schooling, to institute universal child care. I think the state has to step in, and the state can't step in unless there's a major political change that enables us to raise enough public funds to actually support these things.
I would say we spend a lot on schooling, even in places that don't do a very good job.
That's also true.
We have enormously successful higher education system in the United States. I think it's hard to argue we don't have the best higher education system in the world.
The best elite.
The
best
elite level. I mean,
we don't graduate as many people as most of the other advanced democracies.
I agree that, but we can compete at the high level with anybody around the world.
And that fits the U shape.
I'd like to leave a little time for the audience. In the back, with the glasses and the hand high. Yes, you. Yes.
You have to raise your hand high if you want to ask a question.
This question's for Professor Murphy. How do you respond to Professor Saez's comments about the international comparisons between the U.S. And its marginal tax rates versus France in the post-war period?
Yeah, I would say institutions do matter. I don't think that doesn't mean that technology and the other things aren't what driving things in the United States. It's just there's an interaction there between what's going on. If you have the institutions that compress wages, generate inequality. I mean, look at Sweden. Sweden had enormous institutions to hold down inequality. And they were pretty successful, although there was still a big rise in percentage terms, but they still have a lot of institutions that hold down inequality. The other side of it is there are consequences. I mean, average hours in Sweden were quite a bit lower than they were in the United States and other places in response to those kinds of policies. If you looked at education levels, the same response when it was very hard, low returns to schooling were so low in Sweden, people were surprised that it took 8 years to get your degree. Well, when you earned slightly more after you got your degree than while you were in college, it wasn't so surprising why it took so long to get your degree. So I think the evidence I've seen says people do respond. It doesn't mean you can't hold down inequality. You can't. Policies can do that. I would argue, let's be careful about the minimum wage. I think the minimum wage, remember, the poorest people don't work. And raising the minimum wage doesn't help the poorest people in the economy. Actually would reduce their income.
Yeah. So just to say one thing, and tying up to the presentation by William. So institutions versus markets, both are going to matter. And I agree with William. We economists probably don't spend enough time, studying what people in other social sciences do. But I know Pearson pretty well, and actually I've sat with him at events, etc., to discuss those issues. But it's true, we haven't sat together to work really in a multidisciplinary way. And I think we economists, with our statistical methods, our equations, we've been very interested in knowing, what unions do. Do they compress the wage structures, the minimum wage? Kevin was mentioning it. There are very many studies studying whether, changes in the minimum wage, how that affects, the employment, the welfare. Mm-hmm. And I agree, it's not just, I talked about top tax rates because I study top incomes, but what we could call, the neoliberal revolution, the Reagan-Thatcher revolution is much broader than that. And exactly as you've described, you've mentioned the unions, the regulation, the lobbying, the minimum wage. All those things matter and can be studied.
So in the extreme far back corner.
Hi. I have two questions, one for Dr. Saez and one for Dr. Murphy.
Well, only if they're both short. Otherwise, we'll have to exercise the one-question rule.
So for Dr. Saez, my question is how you think the extreme decrease in global inequality has affected the statistics for intra-country inequality and how you think it should be part of the conversation. My question for Dr. Murphy is how you think the increase in country inequality has affected incentive effects. I ask this because I'm a student here. A number of my friends are absolutely the best and brightest, and they are definitely rewarded for their human capital, but they're not necessarily rewarded for doing socially beneficial things. 70%, I think, go into consulting and finance, kind of for this orgy of money. And they're rewarded because they're definitely able to exploit it because they're so smart and ambitious, but it's not necessarily, like I said, socially useful. So how do you think inequality affects these kinds of incentives?
Perhaps you go first.
Yes. So about the first one, so it's true that the fact that India and especially China are growing so quickly and catching up with the advanced economies means that at the global level they are a strong force towards equalizing, reducing inequality at a global level. So why is it that we don't talk more about it? I think it's because inequality has very strong, border effects. Essentially, we think about ourselves as society. That's why, again, the striking number is that we share 35% of our incomes. In the US, in France, we share 50% of our incomes. And the border effects are tremendous. The US public, the Garden program the US public thinks is the most wasteful is foreign aid. Which actually, in principle, from an economic point of view, that's what does the most to equalize incomes.
Kevin,
yeah, I would say I think the evidence is strong that incentive effects matter. I think you can incentivize people to do good things and bad things. I think people are going to respond to both. I don't think on the whole education is a bad idea. I think sometimes people get educated and do worse things than they would otherwise. I think,
but they do it better.
But they, yeah, that's true, and that's true of markets too. Markets are very good at doing whatever you give them the incentive to do. If you give them the incentive to do bad things, they'll do bad things. It's just that's the way the world works. And people think that people who say markets work means that markets never do anything wrong. They'll do whatever you give them the incentive to do, and they'll do a good job of it. And if it's bad incentives, it'll, all these banking crisis things prove that pretty well. They'll take good advantage of the distortions you create. So I think there's no question that we've improved the functioning of markets, that there's more access to markets. I invent Five Guys today. I can have Five Guys over the entire country pretty quickly, much faster than I could expand McDonald's in the 1950s. I come up with a good idea in many other areas. I can attract talent. I can attract capital. That's going to matter. Now, if I come up with a bad idea that's something socially destructive, I'm going to be able to fund that real quickly, too. It's fact.
The lavender shirt. Yeah, please feel free to laugh at me, but I don't know how else to do it.
That's okay. I have one comment, and it's open to the panel, and then one question. What would be the Gini coefficient for someone like Steve Jobs, Bill Gates, when you look at them as college dropouts and what they've done in terms of the amount that they've produced, not only in terms of novel technology, but jobs? So that's question number one. Then question number two kind of weaves all of what's been discussed when we look at the drivers, not only in terms of education policy, health access, economics, or this science is the best at modeling. So, is there a chart or a graph that shows the changes in income over the life of an individual and the difference between 1970 with a manufacturing and industrial-based economy versus a knowledge-based economy? Because I can keep investing in my human capital, but I have 5 degrees, and that's going to cost money. So how do we address a changing economic, geopolitical environment and take and model lobbying, corporatism, change in income over time, all of the topics you've discussed?
So could I suggest that we delegate one person from the panel to answer
We'll have
that?
another panel to address all those issues next time. Go ahead.
No one wants to take a stab at it. You've stumped the experts.
Because I think that doesn't match the ground, and this is a robust intellectual group. What you have all presented is true, but it is the confluence and the nuance of all of your work in research that really hits the woman that was on the cover of the New York Times, working 3 jobs, and she died in her car while she was studying to get an education.
Yeah, first thing I would say, we talk human capital and we have too much focus on education. That education is important, but if you think about skills and human capital, it's so much broader than education. And education we like because it's measurable. It's something that we correct the statistics on. But, historically, the differences within education are enormous. If you ask how big the difference in years of schooling have to be between 2 people before I can be 95% certain that the guy with more schooling earns more than the guy with less, it's like 18 years. It's unbelievable. It's like a kindergartner and college graduate.
It's a University of Chicago PhD.
Yeah. It's amazing, and we never want to forget that. And that's part of what's behind the Bill Gates stuff you talk about. It's just there's so much more there. But all those skills have gotten more valuable. I think that's the point. And it's not surprising in a world in which I keep coming back to it. The ability to allocate resources to people who have talent is really gotten bigger and bigger over time. And it doesn't have to be that your father is Rockefeller. I mean, that's kind of good in some ways, but it creates a different form of inequality. And that's what you guys are finding, is that more of this is business income, labor income, and more of it are guys who are self-made. That's the facts.
Emmanuel, if I might ask, Kevin is not the only person to have mentioned technology as a factor that your analysis may neglect or may underplay. I wonder how you respond to that rather frequent.
Sure. In terms of technology, if you look at the very long time period, countries have gone, through cycles of technological revolutions. And what is striking historically, at least if you look at the top, but it's true here, we've looked only at one piece, of the evidence. The top, you can have big technological revolutions and not fundamentally change, the level of income concentration, and especially capital income concentration. And it is this historical fact that it's true right now in the US. It looks like human capital is extremely important. Now, with this level of income inequality plus savings, I don't know what's going to happen. And low inheritance, tax rates, I'm not sure that 30 years from now we'll be able, to still say that everything is self-made. Human capital is very important, at least at the very top of the distribution.
Arizona State.
Hi, this is for Professor Murphy. Professor Saez mentioned that in his findings, income inequality was pretty serious in 1920s and 1910s. Do you think human capital was also an explaining factor during that time? So if so, was there a decrease in human capital returns in the 1930s and 1940s?
There was, really in the 40s, that over that same period, and this is in Claudia Golden and Larry Katz, they talk about a century of inequality. And that one thing is there was a big reduction in the early 40s in the returns to education, for example. College premium fell dramatically between the 1940 census and the 1950 census, and probably as big of a change as we've seen in recent years in the opposite direction. The other thing is, if you look at like Claudia Golden and Larry Katz's work, it emphasizes the same story. Supply really mattered. We had a huge growth in universal high school education for people. It wasn't college. The story at that time was high school education, tremendous expansion in the supply of then high school graduates, which was the high-skilled group of the day. And that had a tremendous job of opening up opportunities, increasing supply of the then more skilled workers, and reducing the relative supply of the then less educated workers. And I think you should look at, they have a book, I forget the title of it, it's a century of human capital century, something like that. And they basically play this supply and demand model that builds on the kind of model Larry and I used for the more recent period. I think it's a compelling story that human capital plays a role. Now, at the very top, Emmanuel's stuff shows that it's not all about labor income. There's a big reduction in capital income and other things back then. And the rebound we're not back where we were in 1920 in the composition at all. And I think Emmanuel did a good job of showing the composition today is really different than the composition then. But that doesn't mean human capital played no role back then. I think it actually played, and Larry Katz and Claudia Golden's work would say it was important. But it was high school, not college.
Did you want to?
Yeah, no, I agree that education was important. And again, I want to say, it's what happens after World War II. You have the GI Bill that suddenly the government is going to pay, systematically for college for veterans, so typically men, and that's where you see, the college graduation rate to shoot up. So I'm totally in favor of strong government policy, to improve education. Historically, you need the government and so the public, to ask for it.
Before I let you go, I'm sorry, but I need to tell you about our next director's lecture, because Emmanuel Saez is only the first Roman Family Director's Lecture. There is another one scheduled. Peter Cole, who was a MacArthur winning, we don't only invite MacArthur's, it's just that the MacArthur Foundation imitates our taste. Peter Cole, who is a MacArthur winning poet and translator, is coming to speak about the poetry of the influence machine. No, not lobbyists. On translating oneself into another. With that, let me invite you to join first to thank our panelists, and then to join us outside for some more liquid form of thanks.